Hello, my name's Serafina Lopez,
And I'm Kathleen Gross.
and we're doing the Stanley Milgram obedience experiment.
The object of the experiment was to find out whether individuals, if placed in a situation where they were asked to cause harm to another individual, if they would actually follow orders and cause harm to another, and whether it went against their conscience or their ethics. Back in July of 1961, Stanley Milgram began his experiments to examine the conflict between personal conscience and obedience to authority. He wanted to answer the question, could it be that Adolf Eichmann and his million accomplices in the Holocaust were just following orders? Could we call them all accomplices? Adolf Eichmann said that he was only following orders when he sent millions of people to the concentration camps. Participants for the experiment came from newspaper advertisements and a direct mail campaign for men, and it was said to be a study concerning memory and learning taking place at Yale University. And then they chose 40 men. The personnel involved were going to be a teacher, a learner, and a researcher. Out of the original experiment, 65% of the participants administered the highest shock of 450 volts. There were 18 variations on this experiment. In one where someone else administered the shock, 92.5% administered the highest shock. In the experiment that took place in a rundown building instead of a laboratory at Yale University, 48% administered the highest shock. When the teacher and the learner were in the same room, only 40% administered the highest shock. When the teacher had to force the learner's hand onto the shock plate, only 30% administered the highest shock. When the experimenter gave instructions over to the teacher over the phone, 21% administered the highest shock. When the experimenter was replaced by another participant wearing ordinary clothes, only 20% administered the highest shock. When the participant was unwilling to give the shock to the learner, they were given prods. The first prod was, please continue. If they refused, prod 2 was, the experiment requires you to continue. For prod 3, it was absolutely essential that you continue. And for prod 4, you have no other choice but to continue. For this, when they reached the fourth prod, if they did decline, then the experiment was halted.
The participants used were 40 males, ages ranging between 20 and 50 years old, and they were collected from the New Haven and surrounding areas. The participants included workers, skilled and unskilled. 4 were ages 20 to 29, 5 were ages 30 to 39, 6 were ages 40 to 50. Sales, business, and white-collar workers were 3 aged 20 to 29, 6 aged 30 to 39, and 7 aged 40 to 50. And professional, 1 aged 20 to 29, 5 aged 30 to 39, and 3 aged 40 to 50. Education levels range from elementary school. One participant had not completed elementary school, and others had doctoral degrees. The experimenter was John Williams. He was a Confederate, so he knew what was going on in the study. He was a 31-year-old high school biology teacher. And the learner of the experiment was James McDonough. He was also a Confederate, 47-year-old accountant, Irish-American male. The materials used were a shock generator, which had 30 switches ranging from 15 to 450 volts with 15-volt increments. On the left-hand corner engraved was shock generator type ZLB, Dyson Instrument Company, Waltham, Mass, output 15 volts to 450 volts. This was used to authenticate the study. Slips of paper were to be drawn from a hat to determine the role of learner or teacher. This was fixed with both pieces of paper saying teacher. Chair was for the learner to be strapped into was known as an electric chair. There was electrode paste, and it was in an institutional setting. The measurement was willingness of participants through a controlled observation method. They were to observe reaction and response of participants through controlled instructions. willingness of participants to obey authority through the prods. The primary dependent measure for any subject is the maximum shock he administered before he refuses to go any further. This was taken from Milgram's original study. And agentic state, which is a shift in responsibility from the follower to the leader. Power of situational variables, defiant subject or obedient subject. Validity. The internal validity of the paradigm was questioned on the premises that the laboratory context precluded subjects from construing their behavior as truly harmful. Evidence suggests, however, that Milgram succeeded in operationalizing the construct of destructive obedience to authority. People underestimate their own proclivity and that of others generally to engage in destructive obedience. Studies testify to the internal validity of Milgram's paradigm and in turn contribute to plausibility of extending the findings to more complex non-laboratory contexts. Differences between the research setting and the natural target setting, for example the military, can serve to strengthen, not weaken, the case for ecological validity. The procedure. Participants will be recruited through newspaper advertisements or direct mail solicitation to participate in the study on memory and learning at Yale. Participants will be paid $4.50 for being a part of the study, and they will receive payment simply for showing up, regardless as to what happens after they arrive. The participants consist of 40 males aged 20 to 50. The study will be conducted at Yale University in the Interaction Laboratory. Roles consist of experimenter John Williams, learner or victim James McDonough, and teacher, which are recruited participants, also known as naive subjects. Each experiment is to consist of one naive subject, the teacher, and one victim, the learner, which is James McDonough. Each experiment is to participants are to draw slips of paper out of a hat to determine their role. This will be rigged, again, with both slips of paper saying the word teacher. The teacher and the learner are then brought to separate rooms, and the learner will be strapped to an electric chair. An electrode will be attached to the learner's wrist, and electrode paste will be applied to avoid blisters and burns. The experimenter will state that the straps are in place to prevent excessive movement, and the electrode is attached to the shock generator. To establish credibility, the experimenter will also state that although the shocks can be extremely painful, they cause no permanent tissue damage. The lesson between teacher and learner is a paired associate learning task. The teacher is to read word pairs to the learner. The teacher then reads the first word of the pair and 4 terms. The learner is to identify which of the 4 terms was originally paired with the first word. This is known as the regular run. The teacher is to administer a shock to the learner each time they give a wrong answer. To establish credibility, each naive subject or teacher is given a sample shock of 45 volts, which is administered to the wrist and is administered prior to the beginning of the experiment. This was a real shock. The shock generator consists of 30 switches labeled with voltage amounts, which range from 15 to 450 with 15-volt increments, going from left to right: slight shock, moderate shock, strong shock, very strong shock, intense shock, extreme intensity shock, danger, severe shock, with 2 labeled XXX. The teacher is to move up a level each time the learner gives the wrong answer, announcing the voltage amount. Directly after the regular run is the preliminary run. The teacher is to read 10 words to the learner, 3 of which will be neutral, meaning the learner will answer correctly. 7 shocks will be administered, stopping at moderate shock. A second list of words is given following the same directions. However, teacher is to continue shocking until the learner gives all correct answers. Learner will begin showing signs of protest that can be heard by the teacher at level 300. If the teacher looks at the experimenter, they are to respond with prods beginning at 1 and continuing to 4 if necessary. The experimenter is to stop the experiment when teachers reach the administering of 450 volts. After experiment is complete, teachers will be interviewed, questions will be asked and answered, and attitude scales will be taken. Subjects and victims will also have a chance to meet to assure tensions are reduced. Procedures will be taken to assure that subject will leave the laboratory in a state of well-being.
The experiment findings showed that 2/3 of participants administered the highest level shock of 450 volts, considered a deadly voltage. 1/3 of participants administered a 300 volt shock, considered a dangerous voltage. Participants showed signs of stress and tension, for example, sweating, trembling, groaning, and stuttering. Some even exhibited nervous laughter and smiling, which seemed out of place.
And these are the references we use within our presentation.
Thank you.